Hello and welcome to Ondrel Academy. Today's class will be Bladesmithing Basics with Squire Halavere Blackraven. Take it away.
Hi there. Good morning, everyone. My name is Squire Halavere Blackraven. I am an amp guarder, a squire in amp guard. I have been doing various forms of metalwork for probably 9 or 10 years now. I've been forging steel for probably 3 or 4. And today I'm here to sort of take you on the journey. If you just decided you want to learn how to forge steel, I've decided, or I'm going to teach you how to get started doing that. Bladesmithing is great for everyday use tools. It's great for, events, camping events, cookware, cutlery, stuff like that. Plenty of things you're going to learn here today that we'll be able to transfer throughout both Mundania and LARP life. So first off, I'd like to start by talking about the pros of forging over something like stock removal. Many modern day knives are no longer forged. They're created through a process called stock removal. That's where you take a piece of steel like this, you draw on a design, you cut it out, and you grind it to shape with a lot of tools. While I do use some tools for the finishing, all the shaping, all the profiling, all the bevels are made through hand and hammer. Some of the pros to forging are a refined steel grain. If you think of steel like very finely packed sand at the beach, the sand in the water is constantly pressed down by the pressure of the waves, making it harder, which means it's easier to move on and stuff like that. It breaks less easily through surface tension. It's sometimes you're running through loose sand, pain in the ass. It'll crumble if it's not packed and condensed well enough. Well, most steel modern steel at least, is very well compacted, but the pressure and force of heat and hammer on it refines the steel grain even finer, making it hold better edges, in my opinion. There is some debate about this. Making it more homogeneous and less likely to break if treated well. We'll get into that a little bit later on. It's also a great way to connect to our past if you are a fan of history. Forging metal is probably one of the, maybe I'm biased here, in my opinion, one of the greatest parts of our history. From the corners of North America all the way to Japan, there has been smiths who have taken up and refined ways to create steel, many of which are very similar, proving that there is a correct way to go about these things, even if they differ slightly. Things are generally the same all over the world. They evolved the same all over the world. You can see that in the pieces of history themselves. If you need a more personal reason, this also helps with your arm strength. Oh yeah, you start forging, you're gonna find swinging a sword is a whole lot easier. My common hammer is a 2-pounder, and I mean, you learn to swing this thing like I play amp guard. My swords are 7 ounces. I picked up one of my Bell Blues, and oh man, it's like swinging nothing now. So I mean, if you need that extra bit of inclination, yeah, it'll up your arm strength and dexterity a whole lot. Anyways, moving on from there, I'd first like to talk a little bit about the tools that will be used in forging. So first off, you need a way to hold your steel. Unless you have a really long bar that you can use as a handle, chances are it's going to be too hot to hold. A piece like this is definitely going to need something to hold. Now, tongs are obviously the go-to, but as this is a beginner's class, I'm going to note that you can use a pair of vice grips. Vice grips work great for holding steel, especially when you're new. They're cheap, they're available, and I mean, they work. That steel's not going nowhere. Vice grips are a very good starter piece before you can either decide that you want to invest in tongs, invest in learning to make tongs, or anything of that like. Next, you're going to need a way to hit your steel. Like I said, I've got a couple hammers here. They all have their different uses. Big old crosspeen. That's good for, stretching out material. I've got my 2-pounder, which I showed, and I've got a couple other ones. But you don't need all those hammers. I started out using it's claw hammer. Just your average household claw hammer. Works just fine. So next, after you have a way to hit your steel, you need a way to heat your steel. I use a propane forge because it had the properties that I wanted in it, but sorry, there's some loud dude on the bike. Okay, you can still probably hear it. Like I said, I use a propane forge just because it has the qualities that I want. Propane is very consistent in its heat. It's easy to change the heat. You can forge weld in it, even though it's not the optimal setup. It's all around just it's a good consistent way to heat your steel and not have to worry about melting it. But if you don't want to invest, I think I spent $250 on mine. If you don't want to invest that much money, you can find a plot of dirt. You can dig a hole. You can dig a small trench coming out of that hole that you can lay a pipe into. You can cover up that pipe, and as long as the hole is uncovered, you can duct tape a hair dryer to the outside end. Fill that hole with coal or charcoal. Get that charcoal lit and burning, and then turn on that hair dryer, and that'll create enough heat or air being pushed into the fire to create enough heat to forge steel. You can do it very primitively. You can go, and that's probably one of the best things about forging is there's a hyper primitive option and a hyper advanced option depending on how deep you want to get into it, what your available resources are, and other things of that nature, everything in between. Next, you're going to need something to hit steel on. I have a chunk of railroad that I got from a friend. He got it from a company that was scrapping a bunch of pieces of it. I wouldn't say go look at anvils on like Craigslist because you're going to be really, really sad because they're expensive. They're really, really expensive for an actual anvil. Some companies make modern ones that are good steel. If you've been to Harbor Freight, you've probably seen their little blue anvils. Those work too. Those are cast iron. They're soft, but they do work. I've seen people even go so far as to take a sledgehammer head, like an 8 or 10 pound head, and sink it into a piece of wood and then forge on that. There's a lot of options to do this pretty cheap. Yes?
I have a question. So some of the options that you listed, they don't all have the same like shape. They're like a surface of metal, I understand. But is there, so For reference, my experience with this is watching Forged in Fire. I have no former metalworking experience, but I'm curious about anvil shape, actually. I've seen them on that show use parts of the anvils to shape their metals. Is that something that you need, or is that more of like an advanced thing for metalworking?
I wouldn't say it's a necessity. On my little chunk of railroad, I've sort of ground on a rudimentary horn, and the horn is useful. It's good if you want to open up like circles. Like I use it to make bottle openers, to make the big opening for that, and it's useful. Don't get me wrong, but you don't really need it for the applications we're talking about today. You won't really have a need of it. While having a horn and a hardy hole are nice, they aren't necessary. Our ancestors, way back when, would have had something more akin to an anvil or a sledgehammer sunk in a log. The anvils you see on like Forged in Fire, they're very modern. Within the last 200 years, I'd say. Our primitive ancestors did things with a lot less than we might think, and we can recreate that. So we have a way to hit steel, we have a way to heat steel, and we have something to hit steel on. Next, I'm going to talk about the most basic of PvE. You should wear stuff to protect yourself. You are working with hot steel. Metal on metal creates a very loud noise, and that can really damage your ears. At the very least, you need a pair of earmuffs and a pair of goggles. Earmuffs obviously protect your hearing, goggles protect your face. While forging, little particles of steel flake off. As the carbon is driven out of them, they create scale. That scale can pop off. And it's still hot, a couple hundred degrees, maybe not be glowing, but I've had to get in my eyes. I've had a burn on my eye, which is not a lot of fun at all. I've had bouts of tinnitus from the noise, just 3 days of that ee sound in your ears. You don't want it. Like all things, you want to take steps to make sure that if this is something you enjoy, you can do it for a very long time. All right. And then the last piece I'm going to talk about as far as the tools of the trade go, don't wear nice clothes when forging. You are working with fire. You're working with hot steel. You can drop it. You can get too close to the forge and burn your eyebrows off if you're not careful. You want to make sure that what you're wearing, you're not going to worry if it gets destroyed in some form. The shirt I'm wearing is covered in holes just from scale and stuff like that. It's just no reason to wear don't wear your nice clothes. So moving on from there, that's all I'm going to say about that. It's relatively, I think it's pretty common sense. I want to go over some of the terminology next that I'll be using today. There are many parts to a knife that we maybe don't think about on a day-to-day. So we've got ourselves a knife. We have, and these are the terms that are going to concern us today. We have the point, which is obviously the sharp pointy end. You don't want to touch that. We have you see better on this side? We have the bevels, which you can see are the sloped portion that comes down to the cutting edge. We then have the cutting edge. Sharp part, don't touch it. Next, we have the spine of the knife, which is the back, typically the straight portion. Next, we have this little bit right here, where it's unsharpened between the blade and the handle. That's the ricasso. It has some uses. Sometimes it's just there for aesthetics. Sometimes it's there to make sure you have a barrier between your fingers and the blade. So if you don't have a finger well, you might, inadvertently run up it. And you want to be able to have some form of protection from that. Next, we have the tang. which is the portion of metal inside the handle. There are a couple different forms of tang. What this is, where it's the full shape of the knife, and then you just attach scales on either side. This is called a full tang. The other type that is a bit more traditional, you'll see in like swords and daggers and stuff like that, is a stick tang. And this, you will typically take a piece of wood, either drill or burn a hole through it, and then it'll slide up onto this. And it can either stay seated inside the tang, or it can be put onto a butt cap and then hammered over and peened out. And you can make a handle solid that way. Yes.
So I've seen in those ones, can you also add like threading on the back of it and add something to screw on, or is that a different kind of tang?
Yes, you can. So normally with that is, yeah, that's threading. Some people like to thread pommels onto tangs. Even if you don't thread it on, I actually have an example. So for something like this is a dagger, obviously. It has a pommel that needs to go on. It is not threaded, but it is turned down into a circle so the pommel can slide on. And then with that affixed, it'll be peened over and held on that way. So yeah, you can thread it, or you can just have the pommel sit on. All right. So those are the parts of the knife that we'll probably be going over today. Another quick rundown, just because that was kind of long-winded. Point, bevels, spine, ricasso, handle, butt. The butt is the very end. I think we didn't go over that one. So we have the terminology down now, and the next thing I would like to go over is just the idea that you should design a knife before you make it. I do a lot of instinctual smithing, which is where I just kind of take a piece of metal and I hit it until it has a shape that I think is cool. But if you are trying to make something specific, I am a big advocate of having a template. And the template, you can take a piece of steel after you hammer it, you can put it up the paper and say, okay, maybe I need to bend it down this way, or maybe this needs to come up, or this needs to be stretched out more. It's good to have a reference. I'm sure anyone who in the arts and sciences community who's made things understands the value of having a pattern or template to check yourself against. So I'm going to go ahead and get the forge stuff. What's up?
I have a question in regards to patterning or templates. What materials do you normally use as your templates or patterns? And is there variations that are appropriate?
So yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot of variations. I typically just use a sketchbook and I'll draw it out, I'll cut it out, and then once the steel's cool, I'll sort of just like place it against it, see what needs to get removed where. When I decide I want to do just like stock removal stuff, I'll take the template and I'll hold it on with some magnets and I'll just spray paint it. And then the spray paint will contact all the stuff that needs to get removed away. So there's a lot of ways that you can fix it. Some people use wood. They make wooden templates because they are more durable. They just take a little bit more time. Cardboard, plastic, basically anything you can cut a shape out of, you can use as a template. Each have the pros and cons, but it really comes down to personal choice in that regards. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and... I
suppose with like a more durable template, you could use it again more easily, right? Exactly.
Yeah, a lot of times paper templates are kind of ruined at the first time. Then you got to trace after you've got it all cut out, you got to trace it back onto more paper and stuff like that. It depends on how often you make repeat knives. I prefer doing things custom. I don't ever like making two things that are exactly the same. That takes away some of the joy to me. But hey, there's some people who do this. They do it as production. You know, this is how they make a living. So having a repeatable pattern is good. There's a guy up in Canada who he does all his stuff on a CNC mill. So he's got it all saved inside the machine, and he just bangs out like dozens of them at a time. It's awesome. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and get the forge started. So I'm gonna start heating up our steel, and then we'll jump into the actual showing of the shaping of the steel. All right, now if anyone has any questions, the forge needs a little bit to heat up. I'm happy to answer some questions. It can involve any part of making the knife, not just stuff I've gone over. So if you have any questions about anything really, feel free to ask.
I have a question. Oh, go ahead.
I have a personal question.
What's up?
Have you ever submitted one of your blades for like an amp card ANS? And how was your experience with that?
I have actually. 1 second. Forge is louder than I thought. Here we go. I found that it's generally pretty well received. It's not as common as a craft as like sewing, like garb and stuff like that. So it gets a lot of awe factor. The downside is being a less common skill. I feel like it's judged improperly. A lot of times when people see something cool and flashy, they'll judge it higher just because they like the way it looks, even if they don't know exactly if it's good quality or not. And that's part of a downside, I think, to the arts and sciences community, is that it's just we can't expect everyone to have encyclopedic knowledge of all crafts. So it's harder to sometimes judge things perfectly fairly. That's why I enjoy doing things like this, to kind of get a little bit more information out into the community about different crafts and stuff like that. Yeah, that's my 2 cents on it, at least.
There's a comment in the chat here from one of our participants that says that you recently raised a lot of money in a recent West March fundraising event with one of your builds.
Yeah, I donated 4 pieces to the to our kingdom for the silent auction. It was a belt ring, a bottle opener, a cloak pin, and a blacksmith's knife with a nice little leather sheath. I hate doing leather work; it's awful. But yeah, that was a piece I did recently.
I have a question about materials for blacksmithing. Is this something that somebody could get into by using like salvaged material? Or is this a very high bar as far as money-wise to enter blacksmithing?
Absolutely not. Thank you for asking. I'm actually a huge advocate of junkyard blacksmithing. I don't typically buy clean steel, which is just a fresh piece of bar stock from a manufacturer. I prefer to. I've been working the last couple of years off of a couple of leaf springs I got from a guy. His Jeep broke down. He was ready to get scrapped. So I took the leaf springs that help with the. God, I don't know car terminology. It helps with the suspension. But yeah, it's long, flexible bars of steel. It's maybe doesn't hold the best edge, but it's really, really tough, which makes it good for things like swords and machetes. It has a lot of flex to it. And but yeah, you can do a whole lot of stuff just from salvage, and I would encourage you to do so. It's better for our planet. Reusing material instead of just because as relatively low impact as it is, you still have to have a refinery to make steel. Like there's a whole lot of industrialization that goes into it. So if you can cut down on how much clean steel you buy and using good, perfectly salvageable or functional recycled steels, you can you can do at least your share to reduce the creation of emissions. And which I'm not gonna like get on you for buying clean steel. Like I do it from time to time. This is just sort of my 2 cents on it. A couple things that are good to use for recycled steel are, like I said, spring steel off cars. The older the better, but with the older, it means they probably had more wear on them, so you got to be aware of cracks. If you go to like flea markets and stuff, once the world opens back up, find the guy selling a bucket of old files. That's really good steel. I mean, it's steel used to cut other steel, so it's got to be strong. Farrier's rasps. A lot of people repurpose old hammers to turn into tomahawks and stuff. Fury, hey, how's it going? I've worked with probably everything from wrought iron, which is a reasonably primitive form of iron, to copper, to brass, to non-hardenable things. Softer steels that you could typically cast, like brass and copper, they're harder to forge because they do have a lower melting temperature. So I mean, if you have like a coal forge or something and you leave it for a second, you might wind up with a pile of molten brass at the bottom of your pit. It can even happen in a propane forge if you have the heat set up too high. They also work harden, which means just as you hit them, they get harder. So you will need to you'll need to anneal them pretty often, which is just you get it really hot and then you dip it in water, which unlike steel, that softens it. As far as steel is concerned, steel gets harder to work the more carbon it has in it, and carbon is what makes steel hard. So things like the weldable bar stock you buy at like Home Depot, that's got like 0.18% carbon. A file, which is generally considered a very hard steel, has 0.95% carbon. So I mean, the difference between forging mild steel and forging high carbon steel is actually pretty vast. All right, let's go and check and see if that steel's heated up.
Thank you for your question, Fury. For those who are viewing at home after this event, the question was, what metals have you worked with, and is it a learning curve depending on the material? So thank you for answering that question and asking that question.
Okay, so since the steel's almost ready, I would like to quickly talk about the first technique, which is going to be forging in the tip. Like I said, I always choose to start with the tip of the knife, and work towards the butt, just as I think it's easier and more cohesive to do. So when you're forging in the tip, you're going to want to hit it directly on. I've got a little diagram here. You're going to want to hit it directly on the corner, and that'll push it directly back this way. You do that because you want your point to be this opposite corner. If you just hammer straight down on it, this corner will roll over, and you'll get what's called a fish mouth. And then that'll need to be cut or chiseled or ground away, and it's a lot of hassle. If we practice good forging form, we can hammer straight in and create the point right here. Whereas if you go directly down instead of coming in at an angle, you'll get it pushed over and rolled over, and you'll get that fish mouth. So I'll go ahead and show you how to do it. Can you guys see the anvil? I can't tell. Let me lower this back down. I rose up the stand so I could get a better angle. Okay, there's the anvil. So
Cool.
all right. All right. So got our steel, got our safety goggles. I'm gonna go ahead and mute it now. I'm going to start working the corner down like this. You'll also notice that it has sort of widened out this way. We're going to work on keeping that straight too, or else you're going to lose your cohesive cutting edge. So I'm going to put it back in the fire, get it heated up again. We'll continue going on. Here you'll see a little bit where I was talking about the fish mouth. See this point? Yeah, we don't want that point there. So we're going to need to forge that back down into itself so we can create our point with this corner instead.
Hey, Halavere.
Yes.
To make it easier on you so you don't have to keep clicking mute, anytime you go back to the anvil, we'll mute you. Okay?
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Yes, it is. It's their smaller one burner model. Good product. I highly recommend it. It's on the cheaper end, but still it's a little expensive. So I mean, it's really good, isn't it? Yeah, I'm a big fan.
For those listening at home on YouTube, the question in the chat was, is that a Hell's Forge Hall? I have the same one.
What's up?
I was just reading the chat so that people who watch this later can have context.
Yeah, it's the Hell's Forge single burner model. They have a round one and an oval one. I like the oval one because it gives me a little bit more width. Not that I make super wide things, but it's always nice to have the option. All right, you can see the tip starting to get there. I'm getting a little bit of that fish mouthing again, so I'm going to hammer in from the top to push that back down. But we're almost there. Then we can move on to the next portion of this.
I have a question, sir.
Yes.
So I noticed the last time you did it, to where when you hammered vertically, your flat piece bended one way. Is there any way that you can, or like a tool that you can use to stabilize it, so you don't have to worry about that piece bending back and forth?
There might be. I think one of the blacksmith's best abilities is adaptability. There's some people that come up with some really just like off the wall stuff, but it also depends on your steel thickness. This is a 3/16 piece of steel, which is a little thin for forging. Because like I said, it's like clay when it's hot, so it'll want to deform whichever way is easiest instead of the way that you want it to deform. Which is why steel that's a little bit thicker is generally better. Like 1/4 inch is good for forging because it's a bit more stable. But this hammer's easier, so I figured we'd use this for today.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yep. So while we're here establishing the tip, I think it's important to look back on your design. Do you want your blade to have a very long clip? And that's like, that's this portion. Do you want a knife like this? Do you want one with like a more straight spine? Do you want one with a more rounded spine? These are sort of the things to think about while you're in this portion of the forging. Because you can fix it later, but once you're already establishing the profile of your blade, it's a little more troublesome to do so. Which is why I always suggest, like I said earlier, working from the tip all the way to the butt. Just because it gives you the freedom to deal with the problem at hand and not put it off for later. Which is why I wouldn't generally jump from forging the tip to, isolating the ricasso to isolating the handle, and go back and do the bevels. It's so much easier just to go from the tip all the way down and deal with the problems as they come up, instead of doing it with a harder to control piece of steel.
I have a question, sir.
Yes.
My question here is, do you ever find, so obviously there's a lot of planning that goes into this, but do you ever find yourself making, I don't know, some shape that maybe you didn't intend to, but then just rolling with it and making it like a part of the blade as far as moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not much of a planner. I like to just do things and see what comes up. I'll get a general idea in my head, but I'm as long as it comes out that I'm happy with the shape, I'm more than happy to change the project, unless I'm doing a specific build for like a customer or something. But any piece I make for me, I just like to take the steel to the anvil and just let something come out. Eventually, I'll like it, or it'll go into scrap. I'll start over. That's kind of philosophy that I have on it.
Very nice. Thank you.
So another useful tip while you're forging, especially if you're using something like vice grips, is the heat transfer is pretty intense. Like I can't touch this right now without burning myself. Just keep a jar of water nearby, and you can just dip it into there, cool it off, so you can continue handling your piece. All right. So with this last heat, we have our point essentially established. This line down here came from me holding the steel up at an angle a bit. And what that'll do is it'll give us a pre-form to our bottom edge. And it'll take a little bit of the work that we have to do out of forming a belly up towards the tip, which is just the upsweep part that comes to the point. If I were going for something like a Warncliffe, which has a spine that goes down and then it just has a flat belly, we wouldn't want this. But since we're going to go with a decent little belly on this blade, this is a fine shape. It looks like we should probably have it more this way, with this being the clip, this being the belly. That would look like your more traditional knife. But when we hammer in the bevels, here, this is all going to start curving upwards. And that's just the way that the steel works. And then when we get to that point, I'll show you. You're going to see it, and I'll show you ways to correct it, unless you want an extreme curve to your blade. But you see that a lot with first projects, and it looks amateurish because it is. It's a very common thing that most people do when they first start out smithing. But if you don't want your blade to have that shape, I'm going to show you ways to prevent it. Well, we have a minute. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes, I have a question.
What's up?
Let's talk hammers. So before you had given examples of various hammers, what are the benefits of using maybe a heavier hammer versus a lighter hammer?
So a heavier hammer, it's kind of simplistic actually. A heavier hammer will hit things harder. It has a lot more weight that it can come down with. Its maximum yield for metal moved is a lot higher. Whereas something like this little guy right here, I can swing this as hard as I want, and it's probably not going to move that much steel, even with those swings. Whereas something like this 3-pounder, this will move a big piece of steel with one hit. But I'll become more fatigued using it because it is heavier and it is harder to swing. So I typically only use this one for the crosspeen, and that's good for like making squirrel tail tang knives where you got to really like stretch out a long bar of steel. It's also really good for stretching metal out like lengthways instead of just like, or width instead of length, because it pinches the steel and presses it down. Something like, that's what the crossman's good for. The ball peen is good for, it's good for like riveting. You use this little point, and like if you hit like a, like if you're trying to like mushroom out a rivet, it disperses the force more evenly, and you're less likely to crack your rivet material. The other one I use is just this straight peen. And this is a good middling weight. I think 2 pounds is a good like general user weight. It's got very flat surfaces, which is good for hammering out uniform. It's good for hammering uniformly. Something I would like to do with this one is ground this one kind of round so it spreads the material better. But I mean, work with what you got for now.
Do you ever find that you overhammer using the heavier hammer? Or can you overhammer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes you you can kind of get in the groove and not realize that, oh man, I made this way too thin, or my any loss of control with a hammer like this is amplified dramatically. So like if I'm hammering flat and things are going good, but if I turn the hammer and hit with the corner, I leave a big nasty divot in it, and those are really, really hard to get out.
So potentially bigger mistakes if you make them with a heavier hammer.
Yes, but if you practice it with more and if you become more skilled with it, it can be a very beneficial tool.
Nice.
I don't particularly like using the heavier hammer because I find that I do turn it a lot. I'd prefer to have simpler problems to fix, even if it takes a little bit longer. That's my general feeling on it. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm gonna grab the steel now. So let's.
If anyone ever has any questions, you feel free to add them into the chat. Even if it's maybe not an appropriate time to ask a question, we can get to it. Okay? Thank you. Sorry, buddy, you've been muted for the last couple of seconds.
Right, I did that. Right, so we've got our steel now. I'm gonna address this little nub right here just because it's bothering me. But then we're gonna get into some talk about how to forge in bevels. All right, so now that I've got the pre-curve bent in exactly the way that I wanted it, let's go ahead and talk about forming the bevels, which is probably the most important part of this. Because if you don't form your bevels consistently and evenly, you can have a lot of problems down the line. So when hammering steel, let me find another piece of steel just so I can kind of demonstrate on something. All right, so when you're hammering steel, you can see this is the cross section. You don't want to swing down on it flat, because what that does is that'll create you don't create a bevel that way. You create sort of a shelf. So if you hammer here, this point will still be high, and you'll just mush out this middle part. It'll just get flatter. It won't get angled or longer, and it just creates a really sort of unappealing, non-functional bevel. So the way that we're going to do it is we're going to tilt the steel ever so slightly, and then we're going to hit it at an angle. And what that does is that angle creates the bevel, both angles, and it creates sort of that counter bevel form. You'll typically want to do this like on the edge of your anvil, just so you have a flat line. Because I mean, hitting an angle like this in the middle of your anvil is a lot harder than it is hitting on here. You have all this overhang. You can't probably see that. Hitting here, you have all this overhang to work off of. So you aren't hitting this bottom corner of your hammer on your anvil, which can ding up your anvil and also dissipates the force you transfer to the steel itself. So you won't get as effective in the blow. So I'm gonna forge a little bit, and then I'll show you what the bevel starts to look like, and then we can move on from there. Okay, so first sheet in. I'm not sure if you can see it. There really is not a good way to get this. All right, so we've thinned the steel a little bit. You can see right here, there's this bulge. That's kind of what we're looking for. We have established the bevels right here by working at an angle. So maybe if we turn it this way, you'll see that it's starting to get that downwards slope. We use the edge of the anvil right here to start that shape. So I can twist it this way. I can angle my hammer, and I can hammer consistently throughout. It's also important to note that whenever you do to one side, you need to flip over and do to the other side. You don't want to do the bevels all the way down on one side and then flip over to the other side. You kind of want to work in sections and do both at the same time, so you can keep them nice and even. Or else you create much more work for yourself down the line. I know my current setup's not ideal, so if you have questions about anything I'm doing, feel free to ask. I'm maybe not the best at explaining things, and you're not getting as good a view as I would like. So feel free to ask any questions. I will get as in-depth as you need me to.
I have a question.
Yes.
So is there anything that you do to prep the things you're hitting with? Is there any like lubricant that is used, or like greases or something along those lines? Is there anything that you use to like maintain your tools, like a spray of some kind?
If my tools get to a point where they're tools, they're gonna get dirty. I don't particularly pay that too much mind. I mean, this thing's pretty gross. There's a couple spots of rust. I'm not someone who values perfectly fine, neat finishes. So there's not much that I use. The only thing I've done is I've treated my handles. Kind of see it. They don't come this way. They come with this nasty varnish because they're just cheap hammers. I've stripped away the varnish to get down to the true wood, and then I took a blowtorch to it and sort of burnt the grain closed, sanded that down, and then covered it in boiled linseed oil. And what that does is it creates a moisture barrier between the wood and the outside world. So if the wood were to ever get like really wet, the boiled linseed oil fills the pores of the wood, so the water can't, and it's less likely to get waterlogged and cracked. And I do this with all the tools that I really care about. So I do it with this one. I did it with the small little ball peen, the cross peen, and this little gnome hammer that I don't know what it is. I love anyways. The steel itself is, to me, it's not going to get damaged enough that it's going to become useless just from the environment. So I mean, if spots of rust build up, I don't particularly mind it. I don't protect mine. If you were someone who was inclined to very meticulously protect their tools, you could use like gun barrel lubricant. It's called. There's some stuff called like CLP. It's really good. You could use WD-40, mineral oil. All these things mineral oil is food safe, which is good. I use it on a lot of my knives. These are all things that will sort of protect the metal if you are so inclined to do so. All right, steel's heated up. I'll get back to this in a minute.
Thank you.
All right. So as you can maybe see on this, I haven't been very consistent with my hammer swings. This point is out over here. Well, this bevel is out over here. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to spend a little bit of time evening out that bevel, getting it back into place, because you want to try to maintain your edge dead even down the center of the piece of steel. It'll make the final product cut better. It'll make the final product just easier to use. It'll do knife stuff better if your edge is even and down the middle. You don't have to try to compensate for it. So yeah, we'll go ahead and even that out next. Okay, so we're back on track. We've got our edge right back even. We hammered a little too much on that point right there, which isn't bad because there's still plenty of you can see it, plenty of thickness left in the steel. It just means that as we start bringing this edge more and more down, we need to be careful not to hammer too much on that point right there. You can also see that this back end is starting to come up just a little bit. That's kind of the nature of forging. Like I said, it's going to start to bend as these bevels come out. But we're going to take a little bit of time to dress up this area, and then we'll move back onto the bevels. I apologize for all the downtime in this. There's a lot of waiting and involved in forging.
No worries.
So we'll try to move through this pretty quickly. I tend to fiddle too much when it comes to my pieces. I'll fiddle a lot back and forth on the shape. But I'll try to not make that your guys' problem.
I have a question about your downtime, or potentially our downtime. When you do have downtime during forging, what do you normally do?
It depends. I normally work on like 2 projects at a time, just so I can procrastinate on one or the other.
Nice.
So what I normally do is I'll, if my station is a mess like it is right now, I'll sort of grab my stuff and I'll set it down out of the way where it's an easy arm's grasp. Move this back so it doesn't fall off. I'll possibly work on my other project. Like if I'm working on a handle, maybe I'll go, drill holes or grind on it a little bit until the steel is heated up again. Because you don't want to leave your steel in there for too long, because you can burn up the carbon. And a typical forging session, you aren't going to burn the carbon out of your blade. But I mean, if you just kind of pussyfoot around it for too long, you definitely can ruin your steel. So that's something to think about and be careful of. So I'm going to, speaking of which, I'm going to grab the steel right now.
When you say ruin your steel, is it like completely unusable, or you have to scrap it, try again?
So the more you heat it up, the more carbon you burn out of it, and carbon's what gets metal hard, or gets steel hard. So if you burn all the carbon out of it, it won't hold an edge. It'll roll, it'll chip, or maybe not chip, but it'll roll and it'll tear, and just like you can no longer use it for a cutting application with any good form of success. That's what I mean by ruin the steel. All right. All right. So we've got our piece even back out. It's a nice drop point shape. I'm gonna make this as a little skinning knife for a friend who hunts like birds and stuff. So this is just gonna be a little itty bitty thing. So we've got the bevels roughly established. They're nice and even. We've been hammering at our angle, keeping everything nice and consistent on both sides. The bevel starts out probably like this at the base, and then flares out towards the tip, which is a good shape for skinning and like game prep. Next, we're gonna step down to ricasso, just to give it a little bit of distinction from the blade, and then we'll go into moving the shape. I know we're coming towards the end of our time, so I could possibly run this as a two-part class. I can run something for you guys in later.
You got about 30 minutes.
Yeah.
But yeah, also you can do a second part. I'm totally open and available for that. Yeah.
Yeah. If that, as long as that's okay for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Because while I'm trying to get to this guy for you guys, I don't want to rush too much. You know. I want you guys to be able to pick up all the things you would need to forge your own tools. So I'm trying not to rush. I'm trying to rush just the right amount, if that makes sense.
Sounds great. Good call.
All right. So our blade bevel terminates right about here. So this is where we're going to start establishing our ricasso. And what that's going to do is it's going to just push this portion down just a little bit, giving a transitionary point from the blade to the ricasso, and then from the ricasso to the handle. So you have some good partition there. Might clean up this bevel a little bit. It's a little wonky. Kind of dips in right there. But yeah, that's where we're gonna go next. All right. And so now that that's back in the fire, or heating up again, how we're going to do this is we're going to come back to the edge of our anvil. This one has sort of just this sharp point right here. That's exactly what we want. We want a good sharp transition from the blade to the ricasso. At least in establishing it. If you decide that you want to have a curved ricasso, you can do that with tooling later on. A lot of people will use like a round bar of mild steel, something like this, and they'll use it to like hammer in like swells and bends. So that's an option. But I think for just learning how to establish ricassos, the flat step down is probably the easiest. So that's what we're going to do.
You are muted, sir.
Thank you. So this is what we're starting. This little cut down right here. We're going to drag that in probably about 1/4 of an inch. For your first heat, you always just want to establish it before you start going like really, hog wild trying to hammer it in. Just so your edge of your anvil has somewhere to catch and you don't like right up onto the blade or something like that. So next heat, we're going to go a little bit more aggressive with it. Might get the bigger hammer, and then we'll move on from there once we have that established. And a point to note, while you're hammering on steel, every time you hit it, the steel moves, and many times it moves in places you aren't trying to move it to. So while we're hammering down on the spine for this, we're creating that sharp transition for the ricasso, but the steel is also on the top compressing and flattening out, which is why you'll see me constantly take it to the flats and hammering those flats back out, just because we want to keep things consistent. Anytime you hammer on the spine side instead of the flat side, you pinch the steel. If you have a really wide surface to do this with, you can kind of alleviate some of that, but because hammers are generally, at least, pretty small, it's kind of hard to do that, which is why you'll get those dips and you'll get those, the mushrooming of the spine. So just, if you're doing this, make sure to constantly check your piece for mushrooming and get that flattened back out, because it'll make it hard to attach handle scales. It'll make it hard to flatten out. It'll make it hard to add bolsters to. And it creates a hang up if you're trying to cut something with it. It can get hung up on that mushroomed out part, and it's just not good. There are some historical examples like the Kyber knife that did have very pronounced T-section spines, but those have their own purposes. And for a modern day general purpose cutting tool, it only hinders the piece. Okay, so we've got the side down that we want. That's a good transition. It opens the belly up to not be restricted by any forging that we do. And I think that about covers the blade. Since I'm not going to have enough time to finish this whole thing, I guess we'll make this a 2-part project. We've covered the blade. We've covered hammering in the tip, hammering in bevels, as well as isolating the ricasso. I guess with the next one, we will focus on finishing out the handle, isolating it from the ricasso. We will do the heat treating, hardening it up, and then we'll do the tempering. And then all that leaves left is the finish work, and then this will have been a completed knife. Let me go ahead and drop the forge. Okay. So this is probably a little hectic. I am open to questions at any time. You can, my name is Kyle Bates. You can find me on Facebook. If you have any more questions about this, I'm open to questions right now that you might have. But if you guys decide you might want to try this and start at a later time, feel free to hit me up. I'm happy to talk about it. If you have any questions on anything we did today that I wasn't maybe clear enough about, feel free to ask. And yeah, we'll let the steel cool down. Forging puts a lot of stress on steel, so you always want to let it cool down, heat back up to its critical temperature, and then cool down in your forge. That normalizes the steel grain. But yeah, I think I will call the actual demonstration part of this project today done. Thank you guys for attending. Like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And yeah, there will be a part 2 at some point where we finish this up.
Thank you so much, everybody. If you want to unmute and give a quick round of applause, I appreciate it so much. Thank you. I know I learned a lot. I hope the audience at home and here today did as well. I think so. Yeah, again, thank you so much for teaching us today. Those of you at home, keep watching more videos. I'm happy you ended up watching this one. And once again, to repeat a little bit of what Halavere said here at the end, his name here is Kyle Bates. You can contact him. He said that that's appropriate, and ask him questions if need be. Go ahead. There's likely a part 2 to this video, so go ahead and we'll add the link in the description here as well. Thank you so much. And
thank you, Halavere. Yay.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah,
Sorry we didn't get to complete this today, but I maybe underestimated how long this would take.
it was good to spend the afternoon with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. We're going to stop recording now. Yes. Let me know when you're done recording.